Ortiz, and this is my podcast, Abiding Under Biden. It's actually one of two podcasts I do on a regular basis. The first one, the other one, is called What the World is Coming To, and I look at basically how the events that are taking place on an international level relate to what the Bible forecasts as the events of the end times, particularly the development of one world government, one world economy, and one world religion, and also those things that will precede the second coming of Jesus Christ. This particular podcast differs in that instead of looking at international events, it tends to be more local. I look at things that are going nationally, things of national interest to those of us who are Americans and those who are directly affected by what takes place in America, which is basically everybody, but we call it sometimes inside baseball, where we're really looking on the inside of events and seeing how things are related that may not be particularly obvious to other people. And I apologize if it takes on a decidedly political sound sometimes, as if I'm choosing one side of the argument over the other. To be honest, I do. But I would say that I come to it fairly honestly. My major in college was political science. My plan was to become a lawyer. At least that was my dad's plan. Since he was paying all the bills, I think I had to honor it. But that was before I came to Christ. But even after I became a Christian, I was decidedly progressive and left-wing in my political points of view, maybe in rebellion to my parents, who were, we call Reagan Republicans. But I grew up arguing with my parents about political issues. And so we were a very politically thoughtful family and very interested and observant. And I've remained that way all my life, although I would say that over the years I've become far more conservative in my views, maybe just out of the practical reality. As you grow older, you see things through a different lens. Someone once said that if you're young and you're not a liberal, then you don't have any heart. And if you're old and you're a liberal, you don't have any brain. I think it's kind of a harsh way to dichotomize the argument or the discussion, but the simple reality is that as I've grown in my life experience, I've had a chance to see many progressive left-wing socialist communist dynamics played out, fascism as well, around the world. You come to realize that the free market system that America has is the best that there's on the planet. But the reason why I do these is we need to understand that that's not the ultimate goal of the plan of God, that the sovereign God has a plan for the world, and I'm not sure that America has a central or key place in the history. When we talk about the MAGA movement or Make America Great Again, I think it's important to keep in mind that there's coming a point where America cannot be great again because it has to move aside for the development of this one world global system. I don't say that happily, and I fear for my kids, my grandkids, growing up in a world that doesn't have the same freedoms and privileges and even the prosperity that we know in America. But I know at the same time that if the Bible is true, and I believe it is, and if I believe the Bible forecasts the future, then we have to accept the reality that one day we're going to arrive at this place where there is a globalist system in place that is diametrically opposed to the biblical faith and Christianity. My hope is that as a Christian, we will be raptured out of here before that comes into full force. But there again, that's a conversation, that's an in-house conversation amongst Christians, whether that's the case or not. But the bottom line is, we know what the trajectory of history is. We know where things are going to land in the end. And I use a couple of passages of Scripture to kind of guide me in my thinking about these things. The first one is in 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 32, where he's talking about 200 men from the tribe of Issachar, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it says of them, they understood, that is, that they were able to make sense of the times they were in, and they knew what Israel should do. In other words, they were able to see the trajectory or where things were going, and just by using wisdom and insight and life experience, they could see where these things were headed and how they would end up. And in a way, that's what Scriptures provides for us. It provides for us not only foretelling events in very specific ways many times, but also it kind of tells us the trajectory of choices. That, in other words, in a world of free will where we make choices, God says, if you do this, this is where you'll end up. And Proverbs 14:8 puts it this way. It says, the wisdom of the sensible is to understand his ways, both the way he should go and shouldn't go, what he should do and what he shouldn't do. And so what we really seek to do is look to the scriptures and then look at the events around us and try to have wisdom. What's the most sensible way for me to address what's going on? And the last couple of passages I want to look at is also in Proverbs. Proverbs 22:3 and 27:12. It's the same proverb. And the fact that Solomon repeated it, I think, should be instructive to us. This is something he wants us to pay special attention to. He says, the prudent man sees danger and takes refuge, but the simple man keeps going and suffers for it. Now, the key part of this is that if you see the danger, you go to refuge. But what is the refuge he's talking about here? Is it a cabin in the mountains of Montana with a sniper rifle and a bag full of canned goods so I can fight off the blue meanies? Is that what refuge he's talking about? Personally, I don't think so. What I think he's talking about is taking refuge in God's word and in his truth, and then making decisions based upon God's leadership in your life. Now, the mountains of Montana are part of the way that God's going to lead you, and you feel like he's leading you to disengage from the world and its problems, well then that's between you and God. I can't judge that. I can just judge this, that's not what God has called me to. I feel like he's called me to rush into the burning building and try to save as many people as I can. And I don't say that because I'm particularly heroic or I particularly like the idea. Someone said you only know how brave you are is when you get close enough to feel the heat of the flames. And so we'll see as times get difficult how much bravery there is in my statements. But the truth of the matter is, my refuge is in the Lord, and I really want to know what God says in his word as I look at the things that are going on around me every day. And when we look simply upon the national scene here in America, things are moving at obviously a dizzying pace. The progressives that have taken control of the administration, which I believe in some ways have been in control of our entire U.S. government for some time, but nonetheless, they're seeking to implement radical changes of the most extreme kind within the shortest period of time. I think it's because they're living in fear of the 2022 election. They realize that they really gained the presidency and the administration and through a lot of chicanery, and they're pretty concerned that they're not going to be able to pull it off a second time, especially if the Biden agenda doesn't work out well, because we're already seeing signs of inflation and problems within the stock market. And even the Bank of America came out yesterday and said they were concerned that we are going to go into a period of hyperinflation, which is disastrous economically for all of us. Basically, your money begins to lose value at a very fast rate. And how fast and when that ends is up to anybody's guess. But the incredible amount of borrowing and spending that the Obama administration is trying to accomplish is really basically to keep on spending while you're going bankrupt. So anyway, but what I want to talk about is not so much the economy or those dynamics. What I want to look at is something that's really kind of unusual, and it's basically what I call Democratic Party fratricide. What does the word fratricide mean? Well, it's from a Latin word, means frater, which is your brother, and cadere, which means to kill. And basically, it's killing your own brother so that you can advantage yourself and eliminate them as a rival. And it's something that's fairly common throughout history. It's certainly common in the Bible. We have all sorts of stories, beginning with Kane murdering his brother Abel. The idea is that I'm going to gain advantage by eliminating you. And we find all sorts of individuals in the Bible, Abimelech, Absalom, Jehoram, and others did this with frightening cruelty. And as a consequence, what they do is they eliminate all the competitors so they can hold the higher ground. Well, I believe that's something we're seeing happening in very subtle ways that really will kind of be overlooked by a lot of people, because we have the idea that a lot of the events we hear in the news just kind of happen all of their own, when in fact there are, I believe, puppet masters pulling strings behind the scene. Political players of great power who may never make the front page, or very rarely, but they really are controlling events. Because part of the question that people are asking now is who's actually making the decisions in the Biden-Harris administration. I don't think it's Biden. I mean, I think he's clearly just a cipher who reads the teleprompter and is so cognitively challenged that, when he doesn't have a prompter in front of him, he goes off message and says some really confusing things. The man is really in serious decline. Anybody that denies that just likes not telling the truth. But at the same time, I don't think it's Harris either, although I think she's the heir apparent. I think it's other players behind the scene, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But what I find interesting is the sudden downfall or decline of two gentlemen who were viewed by many people as being the heir apparents, the guys who would take over the White House after Biden was forced to step down or had to, or was not able to run in a 24. And they were Mario Cuomo and Gavin Newsom. Cuomo of New York and Gavin Newsom of California. Cuomo was, during the election, before Biden was elected, was the number one choice of Democrats by 80%. 80% of Democrats said he was the guy that they would support. Gavin Newsom, not nearly so much, but very popular, very handsome, and very well-spoken. And they all of a sudden began to drop very, very quickly and have essentially been sidelined as political candidates. And what's really more amazing is this fall of grace didn't come through Republicans or progressives or even ostensibly from moral failures on their part, although that's been the accusation against Cuomo, which I think is part of the organized assault. But it's really come from Democrats themselves who have done this. The Republicans and conservatives haven't caused their downfall. This is coming from Democrats. Even Newsom's recall that's going on, and he'll probably lose, is really being fostered by some of the most extreme elements of the Democratic Party. And we sit back and go, well, why is this happening? And I think it has basically everything to do with eliminating them as competitors against the one who was chosen to fill the office after Biden, and that's Kamala Harris. So how do I come to this conclusion? Well, I think it has to begin with understanding who George Soros is. And there's a lot of things that are said about Soros that some things, that accusations by conservatives that are untrue. I mean, he's called a billionaire who made his money by betraying the Jewish people. I don't think that's the story. You can read here his testimony yourself and his explanation of his childhood. But the long and the short of it is that he is a billionaire who runs a thing called the Soros Fund Management, which is a hedge fund. And he made billions upon billions of dollars, in some cases like in England, causing the British pound to crash. But basically, he's the founder of the Open Society Institutes. And I think that if I were trying to understand what really motivates George Soros, it was the fact that he saw the effect of Nazism and the genocides, and he really has a distaste for nation states. That he reasons that if it wasn't for national entities like the United States or Germany or other countries, you wouldn't be able to do these kind of horrible things to your fellow man. That what can save the planet and save humanity is to get everybody to see themselves as being members of the same society so that we all share in common the same great problems. He believes that nationalism is the problem and globalism is the solution. And I think that's the long and short of it. I mean, we can get into all sorts of things about what a bad guy is and how much people disagree with him, but I believe that he thinks he is really doing something very good and honorable, and he's going to be a hero one day in the eyes of mankind. But here's the thing I think is that he's also an incredibly shrewd strategist. And his plan to change America is not so much to destroy America as to remake it so that it will no longer see itself as the center and the hegemonic leader of the free world. And he did that very early on by starting what was called the Open Society Institutes, which basically is seeking to open up countries. It's a lot of what's behind the idea of opening up the borders. He believes people should be able to live anywhere they want and to travel wherever they want and make those decisions on their own. In order to do that, though, he knew he had to control the political environment, and he's done that not only through funding a lot of politicians, but even ones that you would think are important, like district attorneys in major cities or secretaries of states, individuals who control the law and order aspects of the country. Because I don't think he really wants law and order. I don't think he wants necessarily chaos, but he knows that chaos motivates people to try to seek solutions, and usually they're willing to give up their freedom in order to have more safety and security. And that's one of the reasons I think he picked Barack Obama, who relatively was basically an unknown with very little experience. But the next thing we know, he's elected as the senator from the state of Illinois. And then after that, after one term, he became president of the United States. At the same time, he was funding all sorts of organizations like Media Matters, which whole mission is to distort the message of conservatives. The Center for American Progress, which is really an organization to promote progressive ideas. MoveOn.org, which was really kind of the progenitor of groups like Antifa and Black Lives Matter, both of which he has funded liberally through some of his organizations. But basically, he started with Barack, and Barack Obama was clearly a globalist in his view of things when he said things like we're going to lead from behind and many other such things. You realize that he was a man who didn't hold America as a nation state in particularly high regard. He saw us one amongst equals and sought to reduce the impact and influence of the United States, which was disastrous to U.S. Governmental policy. We all know that. We lived through it. But it was in 2007, though, as he was campaigning for president, that New Yorker magazine said that Kamala Harris was the first elected official in California to endorse him. I mean, she early on saw him as a soulmate, and many people saw the similarities, even though he was a male and she is a female, but I'm not sure you're able to make that distinction anymore. But they both come from biracial ethnic backgrounds. Neither one of them come from what we call African American roots, even though they tend to market in that. They're both of biracial background, and they both are extremely liberal, and they're both globalists in their worldview. In 2013, it was after Obama referred to Harris as being brilliant in an event he was speaking at. He raised some eyebrows because he says, by far the best looking attorney general in the country. He raised eyebrows not because it's not true, because it is. She was, that time too, she was younger and very attractive, but the point was that it was a very sexist remark for somebody like Obama to make. But, as it goes on, later on, Obama suggested that he saw in her the symbolic passing of the torch. In other words, that he saw in her someone who could succeed him, that after his 8 years in office, she could take his place. Which maybe kind of explains why a one-term senator, once again, ran for president on the Democratic ticket in the presidential primaries. And unfortunately for her, she was very unsuccessful. But it's interesting. Sturgis Fellows Institute did a research report on the relationship between George Soros and Barack Obama, and found that basically together they had strategized a plan for Kamala to run for president. They were behind her primary run, and because they saw her as the one they wanted in the White House in 2020. That was going to be Obama 2.0. And in fact, the report made the following. It says, because there's such a broad appeal of Soros's protege, Barack Obama, Mr. Soros has been searching for a similar candidate. Mr. Soros has enlisted former President Obama to teach Senator Harris how to be silky smooth in her rhetoric and delivery. Well, he didn't succeed. I don't know how much he tried, but her biggest problem is she's basically pretty unlikable. I mean, she has that same kind of irritating quality that Hillary Clinton had, that you felt like she's just basically disingenuous. She really isn't a truthful or honest or transparent person, which may be the reason why she's remained in the background so much, even after being anointed by the president to take care of the border crisis. which is not a crisis, but now again is a crisis. She's not given a single press conference, or has she even gone to the border in over 40 days. So I think there's a reason why she stays out of the limelight, because I don't think she is popular, and she doesn't translate well when she gives speeches or interviews or talks. But what was more interesting to me, and more to my point, is that when the primaries were going on, everybody criticized Barack Obama because he wouldn't endorse anybody. Biden kept on claiming that he was Barack's successor, but Barack never came back and said that in kind. And then all of a sudden, Bernie Sanders, who is leading in all the primaries and seems to be on the road once again to take over, again has a Saturday Night Massacre where instead of becoming the overwhelming choice, he suddenly fades very quickly, and out of nowhere, Joe Biden rises to the top of the pile. And it's interesting because even at that point, Barack didn't endorse him. That would have certainly split the party or caused people on the Sanders side to dislike him. But it's interesting. It's only after Biden picks Kamala to be his running mate. By this time, Kamala had dropped out because she had less than 1% of the primary vote. And suddenly, out of nowhere, this woman who had been the most antagonistic and aggressive in her attacks against Joe Biden was the one he chose to be her vice president. And it's immediately after that we find that Barack endorses Biden, but he talks more about Kamala than he does Joe. He doesn't say all these long, wonderful things about Joe as a candidate. What he does is he talks about Kamala. He says, choosing a vice president is the first important decision a president makes. And he goes on, he says, Joe Biden nailed this decision. And then he goes on to say that Harris was more than prepared for the job, which he said would require good judgment and character to make all the right calls, and someone whose focuses go beyond self-interest to consider the lives and the prospects of others. And then he goes on to say that he has known her for a long time, which is actually true. That's why it's so interesting, because after he names her as his candidate, Biden says, as he's still running for president, that she's more than qualified on day one to become president. I mean, at one point he even referred to her as President Harris. And then after he became president, he made a point to say, this isn't the Biden administration, this is the Biden-Harris administration. All of this is highly unusual. I mean, her visibility is astounding, because every time we see him signing something in the White House, there's Kamala, sometimes dressed in black. It reminds me of the angel of death over his shoulder, watching him as he's signing away. In fact, she's the one who made first contact to some of the most important world leaders that Biden didn't even call them. She called them and talked to them. And I think it's interesting that Biden made this statement early on. He says of Harris, he says, I want you to be the last person in the room on every major decision. In other words, she's going to be his most important advisor that comes in there. Well, all of this is really highly unusual and raises all sorts of questions. But I think it's really kind of the unspoken secret. The cat is out of the bag, that she is his choice to be his successor. But again, I want to bring this back into focus before some of you begin to lather at the mouth and get all upset about what's going on and the way it's handled. You have to understand that everything that's going on right now in Washington, D.C. is done in an effort not to destroy America, but rather to destroy its historical identity. They want Americans to no longer see themselves in the same way. That's why the MAGA drove these people. It was like kryptonite. It drove them crazy, because basically they don't want to see America become great again. They want to see America become one amongst many equals, and they want America to be just part of a one world global confederacy, where national identities become more like ethnic markers than they become political markers or political identities. So when we look at the future, I mean, if I try to project a little bit, and granted it's my guess, I think that the political class in Washington, D.C. is pretty much all in on some kind of national globalism. But Soros doesn't want national globalism, and those who are in the White House don't want it either. They're seeking to establish a more equitable and fair global system where we are one amongst equals. So at this point, who's calling the shots in Washington? Well, it may be Soros, but I think it's Obama primarily. That, as I said, Joe is merely a cipher who does what he's told. He's the tail. He's not wagging the dog. The dog is wagging him. And it's interesting to see how it all folds out, because the 2022 elections are going to be very definitive. If Republicans take back the House and the Senate, well, then we're into a new series of events that they're going to try to reverse things, although I don't trust any politician. But it's very clear to me at this point that Kamala is the designated replacement. Will she succeed? Will it work? Well, I don't know. But what I do know will happen is, over time, that globalism is going to become the eventual result. And all of these actions are the efforts of those who are true believers in globalism to bring that to pass. And again, I would caution you, you have to understand that these people really believe this is the answer. They're ideologues who tend to be idealistic, and they believe that it's possible to create a utopian planet where everything is wonderful and everything is equal. It's as naive as the communist idealism was. It's ideal as the Nazi or fascist idealism is. And this is just another form. It's more fascist than it is communist, but it maybe is kind of a combination of the two. But the reality is all these things are factors, 1,001 different ways that are all kind of directing America along with the rest of the world to one global government. And which tells me that we probably can only do so much to affect the change. And I would say do whatever you feel God's leading you to do. Most importantly, speak the truth in love. That's because we're getting bombarded with a constant feeding of, I should say, an endless flow of false information and deception and untruths. And we need to speak up, and we can make a difference, at least in the lives of individuals. Like I said, at this point, I consider myself more of a fireman who's going to rush into the flames and try to pull some people out before the whole thing burns down. But most importantly, it's going to burn down. And that's why, as believers, rather than hoping for the second coming of Donald Trump, we need to hope for the second coming of Jesus Christ, and to be looking up for our redemption draws near. That's our redemption. President elections are not. As Chuck Colson so famously said, the second coming of Christ isn't going to come on Air Force One. So, it all means vote, be a good citizen, speak out, do whatever God is telling you to do. I don't want to diminish those efforts whatsoever, if that's where God's directing you, calling you. But at the end, never forget, this earth is not our home. And our citizenship, our real citizenship, is written in heaven. God bless you and go in His grace.